November 1st, 1396. Inside the soaring walls of St. Paul's Cathedral, a sea of flickering candlelight dances across the stained glass windows. The organ echoes through the arches, announcing the arrival of a royal procession. But this isn't just any ceremony, it's the wedding of a 6-year-old girl. At the center of it all walks little Isabella of France, Europe's youngest princess. She's just a child wrapped in gold silk robes that drag along the cold stone floor. A tiny crown, far too heavy for her small frame, presses down on her head as she slowly approaches the altar. Waiting there is Richard II, King of England minus 29 years old, and already burdened by a fractured kingdom. In a matter of minutes, this young girl will be crowned Queen of England. It's not a love story. It's a political deal, one meant to lock in a fragile peace between France and England. But how did a child become the centerpiece of one of medieval Europe's coldest diplomatic moves? To answer that, we have to go back to late 14th century France, a kingdom crumbling under the weight of royal madness. Isabel was born on November 9th, 1389, at the Louvre Palace in Paris. She was the fourth daughter of King Charles VI of France and Queen Isabella of Bavaria. From the start, her life was shaped by turmoil. Her father, Charles VI, would later be remembered as Charles the Mad. By the time Isabel was born, he had been suffering episodes of madness for years. Sometimes he couldn't recognize his wife or his children. He believed he was made of glass, convinced that a simple touch could shatter him. Other times he'd run screaming through palace corridors, claiming invisible enemies were chasing him. And this wasn't a passing phase. It became the backdrop of Isabel's childhood, the king locked away in his mind, and France ruled by regents scrambling for power. Her mother, Queen Isabella, didn't offer much comfort either. Seen by many as cold and ambitious, Isabella used her husband's illness to seize political control. Chronicles from the time accused her of being immoral, distracted by affairs and court politics, with little concern for her children. To her, daughters were assets, valuable pieces in the game of dynastic diplomacy. And Isabel, she was one of the most valuable. So the little princess grew up surrounded by tension. Her home was a palace, but it was no place of comfort. France was locked in the chaos of the 100 Years' War. Two powerful factions, the Armagnacs and the Burgundians, fought for control. Meanwhile, the kingdom bled resources, and the monarchy was stretched to its limit. Then, in 1396, everything changed. A diplomatic opportunity landed in the French court's lap. Across the Channel, England's King Richard II was in trouble. He had spent years fighting France but was now desperate for peace. His first wife, Anne of Bohemia, had died, leaving him without an heir and without a strong political alliance. So Richard made a move. He proposed marriage to a French princess. The French royal advisors, led by the Duke of Berry, saw an opening. If England wanted peace, France would name its price. They offered Isabel, just 6 years old, in exchange for an enormous dowry of peace, 800,000, and a truce that would last 28 years. To a nation drained by war, it was too good to refuse. Isabel, barely out of toddlerhood, would be sacrificed for the sake of peace. Negotiations began. They dragged on for months, carried out with all the warmth of a business transaction. French and English envoys haggled over the terms of the deal as if Isabel were property on the table. Even her age became a sticking point. Some English nobles argued they should wait until Isabel turned 12, the traditional age for marriage, to be consummated. But Richard II didn't have time. He was struggling to hold on to power. Rebellions were brewing, money was tight, and the pressure was mounting. He needed peace now. And the French deal, even with its moral implications, was the fastest way to get it. By October 1396, the terms were finalized. Isabel would be handed over to England, a political gift, nothing more. Her departure was staged like a performance. At the Louvre, her father, King Charles, blessed her during one of his rare lucid moments. He wept as he said goodbye. Her mother, by contrast, treated it like closing a business deal. Cold and practical, she showed little emotion. As for Isabel, she didn't really understand what was happening. To her, it was just a long journey and adventure. She packed a few dolls, a handful of toys, and a small dog that had comforted her at the Louvre. She was leaving everything she knew behind. A grand retinue followed her. Hundreds of nobles, knights, and servants crossed with her from Calais to London. Along the way, English towns held massive receptions in her honor. Local leaders competed to outdo each other, lavish parades, feasts, music, all to welcome the child who would be queen. But for Isabel, the overwhelming pomp brought little joy. Tired and homesick, she often cried and asked to go home. In London, preparations for the royal wedding were underway. Richard wanted a ceremony that would dazzle the realm. St. Paul's Cathedral was transformed, adorned with French and English silks, lit by thousands of candles imported from France. Choirs sang in Latin and French. Everything was choreographed to display unity, to show that peace had arrived through diplomacy, not battle. Richard himself cut a strange figure at the altar. At 29, he was one of Europe's most cultured kings, deeply invested in the arts, poetry, and courtly tradition. He had truly loved his first wife. And now he stood awkwardly beside a girl young enough to be his daughter. To his credit, he treated Isabel more as a daughter than a spouse. But political duty came first. As the ceremony began, the Archbishop of Canterbury had to kneel to place the wedding ring on Isabel's tiny hand. She said nothing, visibly confused and frightened. No joy. No understanding. Just a 6-year-old child trying to make sense of the spectacle around her. When the words were spoken and she was officially declared Queen of England, the crowd cheered. But Isabel only looked around, searching for familiar faces she couldn't find. For the time being, the English court tried to shield her from the darker side of royal life. Richard arranged for her to be raised in a dignified manner. She was given French tutors, her own chambers at Westminster Palace, and a staff dedicated to her well-being. She even kept her dog. It was a strange version of childhood, one lived out behind palace walls with the title of queen, but without the understanding of what it all truly meant. But as you'll soon see, Isabel's quiet life in England wouldn't last. By the time Isabel had settled into her new life in England, everything was already changing around her quietly, and then all at once. In September of 1399, when she was just 10 years old, the world she had been cautiously adapting to was ripped out from under her. Richard II, the man who had made her queen, was overthrown in a swift and ruthless rebellion, led by Henry Bolingbroke, soon to be crowned Henry IV. Richard was imprisoned and taken to Pontefract Castle, where he eventually died, likely murdered under murky circumstances. The exact details were kept vague, but one thing was certain: the king was gone. And just like that, Isabel was a widow, though she had never truly been a wife. This plunged the English court into an awkward crisis. Legally, Isabel was queen crowned, wed, and legitimized by ceremony. But with her husband gone, and no heirs to strengthen her position, she became an inconvenient reminder of a reign many were eager to forget. Worse still, her marriage had never been consummated. In the eyes of some, that made it invalid, but the French didn't see it that way. And then there was the dowry, Ps. 800,000 already spent by the English crown. Returning Isabel meant confronting a potentially explosive demand: either send back the young widow with the dowry, or explain why the money was gone. Neither was an appealing option for the new king. So Henry IV tried something else. He kept Isabel in England, not as queen, not exactly as prisoner, but somewhere in between. She was sent to Havering Palace, a secluded royal residence northeast of London. It was comfortable, yes. She had her ladies-in-waiting, good food, gardens to walk in. But she had no freedom, no choice, no contact with the life she had known. She was just 10 years old. Over the next 3 years, Isabel remained in this quiet captivity. She wrote desperate letters to her family in France, pleading, crying, demanding to be returned home. "I write to you in tears," she said in one letter to her father, "for I am kept here like a prisoner, far from all I love, without hope of return." Her words reveal a girl forced to grow up too soon, shaped by abandonment and betrayal. There was nothing childlike left in her letters. She was still technically a princess, but her days were marked by isolation, anxiety, and waiting. Eventually, her voice reached someone who still had the power to act. In one of his rare lucid periods, Charles VI, her father, responded with a firm demand. He wanted his daughter back, and France backed him. Over time, pressure built on England to release Isabel, especially as tensions with France began to simmer again. After long, frustrating negotiations, Henry IV relented. Isabel would be sent back, but without the dowry. In 1401, after nearly 5 years away, Isabel finally returned to France. But the little girl who had left at 6 had been replaced by a 12-year-old who had already lived through trauma most adults wouldn't survive. She came home not to celebration, but to more chaos. France hadn't improved. The 100 Years' War dragged on, the royal court remained fractured, and her father's condition had worsened. Her mother, Isabeau, received her not with maternal warmth, but with cool detachment. Isabel's return didn't restore anything. In many ways, it just reminded the court of past failures. She was no longer a child bride, but she was still a political tool. Her future would not be hers to choose. In 1405, just 4 years after her return, Isabel was once again caught in the machinery of dynastic strategy. At the age of 16, her mother arranged a second marriage, this time to Charles of Orleans, a young poet and nobleman from one of France's most prominent houses. It was, on paper, another political alliance, but something unexpected happened. This time Isabel found love. Charles wasn't like the other men of court. He was young, only a few years older than her, and deeply immersed in literature, poetry, and the arts. Sensitive, introspective, and kind, he treated Isabel not as a diplomatic contract but as a partner. Theirs was a quiet bond, formed away from public scrutiny, and it quickly grew into something real. For the first time in her life, Isabel experienced a form of happiness that didn't come with a political price tag. Her letters during this time reveal warmth, humor, and even joy. The couple spent time writing poetry together, hosting artists, and escaping the rigid expectations of royal life whenever possible. Their marriage, though arranged, blossomed into something authentic. It was, tragically, short-lived. In 1407, barely 2 years after their wedding, Charles was captured by the English at the Battle of Agincourt, a devastating loss for the French. He would spend the next 25 years as a prisoner in England, and just like that, Isabel lost her happiness once more. At only 18, she was again left alone, not legally a widow, but in every practical sense abandoned. Her second husband, the one she had actually chosen to love, was gone. And this time, there was no throne, no title, and no truce to justify the pain. She returned to court life, slipping into the background. Her days were quiet. She involved herself in charity, commissioned art, and offered quiet counsel to members of the royal family. She had seen diplomacy from the inside and out, had been its victim, its pawn, and at rare moments its survivor. In 1409, Isabel gave birth to a daughter, Jeanne of Orleans. It was her only child. And though motherhood brought some peace, it also came with cruel irony. Isabel knew exactly what fate likely awaited her daughter. Another girl to be bartered, married off, and sacrificed in the endless game of royal politics. Later that same year, just weeks after giving birth, Isabel died from complications. She was only 20. No grand funeral, no royal fanfare. Her death was noted by chroniclers in passing, as if she were a minor court figure rather than someone who had once united two warring nations in uneasy peace. Isabel had fulfilled every role expected of her queen, wife, widow, mother. She had done what was required, what was demanded, what was forced. But she had almost never lived for herself. And yet her story wasn't over. Isabella of France's story didn't end with her death. Not really. While the chronicles of her time moved on without much fuss, the quiet tragedy of her life continued to echo through history, resurfacing in poems, court documents, and diplomatic records, fragments of a life dominated by politics, yet lived with rare moments of tenderness. She had died at just 20 years old, shortly after giving birth, her body exhausted from years of emotional trauma, political imprisonment, and the physical toll of pregnancy. Her final years were marked by a strange calm. No longer a queen, no longer caught between two thrones, she had lived as an aristocratic woman in the margins of French court life. But what she represented was far more powerful than what she lived, because Isabella of France was never just a person. She was a symbol, a tool, a gift, a price paid to secure temporary peace between two nations, France and England, that would soon be at war again anyway. Her short life forces us to confront a brutal truth about medieval politics, that children, especially girls of royal blood, were often viewed as extensions of statecraft, flesh and blood chess pieces. They were not born to live, but to be placed, moved, sacrificed. Her death in 1409 was barely noted in the records. No dramatic accounts, no poetic tributes, no final procession of mourning, just a line in a ledger: Isabel, daughter of France, once Queen of England, deceased. But what her life reveals is much louder than the silence of her death. Isabella of France wasn't an anomaly. She was one of many. Royal daughters across medieval Europe faced similar fates, bartered in marriage markets, exchanged for peace, or simply abandoned when their political usefulness ran out. But Isabel's case is especially haunting because of how young she was and how publicly her childhood was taken from her. Her story has since become a kind of cautionary tale, a quiet footnote that historians revisit when discussing the horrors of child marriage, the cruelties of dynastic politics, and the human cost of monarchy. Modern scholars and feminists look to her life as an early and painful example of what happens when girls are denied personhood in favor of political utility. She had no agency. She had no freedom. And yet, within the strict walls of medieval royal life, She still managed, however briefly, to find moments of joy, love, and dignity. And then, just like that, she was gone. Today, her name is mostly absent from the grand narratives of European history. She wasn't a ruler. She didn't lead armies, pass laws, or reshape kingdoms with her will. But she shaped history all the same by being the living cost of royal ambition. Her memory lingers not in marble statues or triumphant retellings, but in the somber realization that sometimes peace is purchased with the innocence of a child, and that price should never be forgotten. Isabella of France didn't leave behind an empire. She didn't need to. Her story stands as a quiet monument to every child who has ever been sacrificed in the name of power. A queen at 6, a widow at 10, forgotten by history until now,